Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Williamson, and I've been invited to be the moderator for today's webinar on the use of force in armed conflicts, interplay between the conduct of hostilities and law enforcement paradigms. It's great to be here this afternoon in Geneva, and from wherever you are, thank you very much for taking part in this webinar. The first question I had to ask myself as we prepare for this afternoon is why this particular topic? And I think just looking at the headlines that we have seen over the past few days, it is clear that the question of law enforcement, whether it be in armed conflicts or non-armed conflict situations, is particularly topic. A couple of headlines I saw recently in the news brings this to light. Just to quote a couple: heavy automatic gunfire has been heard in Ferguson following a decision not to charge a white police officer who shot dead an unarmed black teenager. Another quote from the news today: at times, the debate surrounding the shooting has focused as much on authorities' response, which also featured officers equipped with military-style gear, including armored vehicles, body armor, and assault rifles, as the shooting itself. A third quote from Liberia: the soldiers are using live rounds, said an army spokesman. The soldiers apply the rules of engagement. They did not fire on peaceful citizens. There will be medical reports if an injury was from bullet wounds. As we can see, a very quick review of today's press demonstrates that the question of use of force, be it by the military or law enforcement elements, is particularly topic. Hopefully today, the four panelists that I'll introduce shortly can give rise to a number of the questions and issues around this particular debate and this particular problematic. We are going to be fairly focused in our discussions today, moving away from questions of law enforcement in peaceful environments, much more to look at contemporary armed conflicts, in particular non-international armed conflicts and occupations. In these situations, we have seen armed forces increasingly expected to conduct not only combat operations against the enemy, but also law enforcement operations in order to maintain or restore public security, law and order. In practice, it is sometimes difficult to draw the line between situations governed by the conduct of hostilities paradigm, derived from international humanitarian law, which I think some speakers will refer to as IHL, or the laws of war, in the course of today's webinar, and those governed by the law enforcement paradigm, mainly derived from human rights law and domestic law. The challenge is the effective determination of the appropriate applicable paradigm, as it has a crucial impact on the humanitarian consequences of an operation, since the rules and principles shaping the two paradigms are different. The ICRC in 2012 organized an expert meeting to discuss the interplay between law enforcement and conduct of hostilities in terms of the use of force and their respective paradigms. This expert meeting gave rise to a substantial number of issues, some contentious, some where consensus was definitely built, but all of which demonstrated the complexity of the issues at stake and the importance for both those in theory as well as in practice. Today, we're hoping that through this webinar and our four panelists, we'll be able to shed more light on some of the controversial issues, but also on those issues where we found agreement in terms of the approaches. Hopefully, and based on the background of our four panelists, you'll see that we can try and blend the theory with the practice, because ultimately we are speaking about the use of force in real situations. So we need to try and move away from the theory to the practical. And the experience of the four panelists hopefully will do just do that. The four panelists, I will introduce them very summarily because you will have their full bios on the webinar as each and the other speaks. But the four panelists, distinguished panelists, are all experts in their own right on the topic of this webinar. To my right in the room in Geneva, we have Gloria Gaggioli, who is a former ICRC thematic legal advisor in charge of legal issues related to the use of force in armed conflict, and also an associate professor at the University of Geneva. In the US, we have Brigadier General Richard Gross, who is the legal counsel to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In Israel, we have Professor David Kretzmer from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And in Bogota, we have Colonel Juan Carlos Gomez Ramirez from the Ministry of Defense of Colombia. So a truly international group of experts for this webinar. If there are some sound delays, we must apologize to those listening, but you will appreciate that we are speaking from different parts of the world. In terms of format, to try and make this as interactive as possible, we have put to the panelists 3 case studies, each of which was discussed at length during the expert meeting. These case studies will come up, I understand, during the webinar for you to look at the background material and to see the respective questions. We will spend approximately half an hour on each case study. The format proposed is that one of the panelists will take the lead on discussing the issues that each example gives rise to. Thereafter, the other panelists, one after the other, will give rise to other questions, issues, contradict, hopefully, on some of the matters, or simply agree with what the other panelist has said. At the end, I'll allow potentially the first panelist to respond if there's any particular critique, or for all of the panelists to start interjecting. My job as moderator will hopefully be to keep the flow going in this particular discussion. But we have received numerous questions from attendees around the world. And the idea here would be to actually put some of those questions to the respective panelists. Thereafter, we'll move to case study 2, case study 3, and at the end, after about an hour and 50 or so minutes, we'll sum up and hopefully come out with a couple of lessons.